There's a rule in Russia that almost no foreigner knows about until the day it ruins his bouquet. You walk into a flower shop, you buy a dozen roses for your girlfriend, you hand them over with a smile and her face changes. Not in a good way, because in Russia, an even number of flowers is for funerals. You just handed your girlfriend a graveyard bouquet on what was supposed to be a romantic night. And that's just flowers, that's the easy part. If you ever marry a Russian woman, you're not just marrying a person. You're marrying a whole operating system, one built on different rules about love, family, money, emotion, and survival. Some of those rules will make your life better than you ever thought possible. Some of them will blindside you completely. By the end of this video, you will understand both, because the difference between the men who thrive in this and the men who flame out usually comes down to one thing: whether they understood the culture before the wedding or after. So let's start with the part nobody warns you about: the mother-in-law. In most Western marriages, the in-laws are background characters, holidays, maybe a phone call. In Russian family structure, the mother and often the grandmother, the babushka, isn't background. She's load-bearing for generations, especially through the Soviet era when housing was scarce and multiple generations were forced to live in the same small apartment. Russian families built a structure where grandmothers raised the children while parents worked. That wasn't a cultural preference at first, it was survival. But it became identity. Even now, in modern Russia, it's completely normal for a grandmother to have a say in how a grandchild is raised, what they eat, what they wear, even what they're named. If you marry into this, you're not just gaining a wife. You're gaining a small, deeply opinionated council of women who have very strong feelings about your life choices. Here's the part that surprises people. Though once that council accepts you, it doesn't just tolerate you. It defends you. Russian family loyalty, once earned, is fierce. There's a reason Russian literature is obsessed with sacrifice for family. Tolstoy didn't invent that. He just wrote down what was already true. So the same structure that feels invasive in month 1 can feel like the deepest safety net you've ever had by year 3. The question is whether you survive month 1. And speaking of surviving, let's talk about the wedding itself, because there's a tradition that catches almost every foreign groom completely off guard. It's called Vikup Nevesty, the bride ransom. On the morning of the wedding, the groom shows up at the bride's apartment to pick her up, and he is stopped at the door, not politely. Family members and friends block the entrance and demand a ransom before they'll let him take her. Could be money, could be vodka, could be answering trivia questions about the bride correctly under pressure while everyone laughs at him. It's theatrical, it's loud, and it's meant to test the groom publicly. Are you actually willing to fight a little for her? It sounds like a joke. It isn't entirely. Anthropologists who study Slavic wedding customs trace the ritual back centuries to actual bride price negotiations between families. The money has lost its real weight. The symbolism hasn't. Now, here's where it gets interesting, because the ransom is just the opening act. Once the wedding actually starts, you discover that a Russian wedding isn't really an event. It's an endurance test, and it's built almost entirely around toasts. In a Western wedding, you might hear 3 or 4 speeches over the whole night. At a Russian wedding, the toastmaster, called a tamada, runs the entire evening like a stage show, calling on guest after guest to stand and speak from the heart. Not polished best man jokes, real, often tearful tribute stories about the bride as a child, stories about the groom's first heartbreak, blessings from grandparents who lived through things you've only read about. And after every single toast, you drink, often vodka, often in full glasses, often more than once. The wedding can run 6, 7, 8 hours. It is, in a very real sense, a marathon of vulnerability disguised as a party. By the end of it, you don't just know your new wife's family. You've cried with them, drank with them, and possibly lost a shoe in a circle dance you didn't know existed 20 minutes earlier. So if the wedding alone is this intense, what happens after, once the celebration ends and real married life begins? This is where most of the stereotypes fall apart completely. Start with honesty. Russian communication culture, broadly speaking, doesn't run on the same diplomatic padding that Western small talk does. Linguists who study cross-cultural communication note that Russian conversational style tends to be lower context and more direct than American or British English, meaning less hedging, fewer, "I was just wondering if maybe," more straight statements. If your Russian wife thinks your plan is bad, she will say your plan is bad. Not "that's an interesting idea," but "have you considered just this is bad?" Here's why. For men raised on indirect feedback, this reads as harsh at first. Over time, most men describe it as the opposite of harsh. It's relief. You always know exactly where you stand. There's no decoding required. But here's the twist that catches people off guard: that same directness in conflict often coexists with intense emotional warmth in private. Public displays in Russian culture, especially among older generations, tend to be more reserved. You won't see a lot of PDA, and you definitely won't see a lot of smiling in formal photos. That resting serious face convention has its own cultural history. A straight face in a photo doesn't mean an unhappy person. Behind closed doors, though, Russian partners are often described as fiercely affectionate, intensely loyal, and emotionally all in. Now let's talk about something that actually has real economic weight behind it: work and money. Because this is where outdated stereotypes are the most wrong. To this day, Russia has one of the highest proportions of women among university-educated professionals globally, including in fields like medicine and engineering. If you marry a Russian woman expecting someone who will simply manage the household while you handle the career, you are very likely marrying the wrong assumption. What you're far more likely to get is a partner who has her own career, her own opinions about the family budget, and zero interest in being financially dependent on you. So if she's independent, direct, and embedded in a loyal but intense family structure, what actually holds the marriage together day to day? It's hospitality as a love language. In Russian culture, feeding someone is not a chore, it's a statement. An empty table when guests arrive is treated almost like an insult to the relationship. That instinct doesn't disappear in marriage. It often becomes the daily proof of love, not declared in words constantly, but shown through constant, almost relentless care. Tea pushed into your hands the second you look tired. Food made because you mentioned once, 3 days ago, that you liked it. This is the part long-term partners describe as the thing they didn't know they needed until they had it: care that doesn't ask to be noticed, it just shows up. And that, in the end, is the real answer. Marrying into Russian culture isn't a softer version of a Western marriage with a few quirky traditions stapled on. It's a different value system entirely, one where family loyalty runs deeper and demands more, where honesty replaces diplomacy, where independence is assumed rather than negotiated, and where love gets expressed through action far more than through words. The men who struggle are the ones who try to import Western expectations wholesale. The men who thrive are the ones who realize they're not adjusting a relationship, they're learning a completely different language of commitment. One toast, one ransom, one impromptu midnight meal at a time. So here's the real question worth sitting with. If the love language you grew up with is the wrong dialect entirely, how much of what you think is normal marriage is just the culture you happen to be born into? If this kind of cross-cultural breakdown is useful to you, there's a lot more where the lines between love, culture, and survival get even blurrier. Subscribe, and let's keep going.